desert wind carried sand like whispers across the tarmac at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, somewhere in the nameless stretches between borders that don't exist on official maps. Lieutenant Commander Kiera Voss stood motionless as the barrel of a Beretta M9 pressed cold against her temple, her green eyes fixed on the horizon where heat shimmered into mirages. The soldier holding the weapon was young, maybe 22, his hand trembling just enough that she could feel the vibration through the metal. His name tape read Garrison, and sweat carved clean lines through the dust on his face. 3 other Marines flanked him, rifles half raised, uncertainty written in their stances. None of them had expected to find a woman in a flight suit emerging from the wreckage of what used to be an EA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft, 7 miles outside the wire in territory that belonged to whoever had the most ammunition that particular day. "I said identify yourself," Garrison repeated, his voice cracking at the edges. The hammer was cocked. Kiera could hear it, that tiny mechanical click that separates intention from consequence. She didn't move, didn't blink. Her call sign was stitched above her heart pocket, Widow. Below it, a small trident insignia that most people missed. The ones who didn't miss it usually took 3 steps back. "Lower your weapon, Marine," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of calm that comes from counting heartbeats in darkness, from making decisions at altitudes where hesitation means death. But Garrison didn't lower anything. If anything, the pressure increased. Behind him, the wreckage of her Growler sent black smoke spiraling into the bleached sky. Somewhere in that twisted metal and shattered avionics was $200 million of American technology, and 3 months of intelligence gathering that could shift the balance of unnamed operations in unnamed places. The ejection had been violent. She'd pulled the handle at 400 feet, doing 300 knots, when the surface-to-air missile proximity alert became a certainty rather than a possibility. Her backseater, Lieutenant Hayes, had punched out 2 seconds before her. She'd watched his chute deploy clean before her own world became a chaos of wind and gravity, and the ground rushing up to meet her with indifferent physics. Hayes was somewhere out here too, if he'd survived the landing, if the locals hadn't found him first, if 1,000 variables had aligned in his favor. But right now, in this specific moment with this specific gun against her specific skull, the only variable that mattered was convincing a terrified Marine that she wasn't the enemy, that the woman standing in the dust with blood trickling from a gash above her eyebrow was something else entirely. Something they should have been told about before they rolled out on this particular patrol. The radio on Garrison's vest crackled with static and a voice broke through. "Reaper 2-1, what's your status? We're getting intermittent thermal signatures near your position. Advise." Garrison's eyes flicked toward the sound, just a fraction of a second's distraction, but Kiera didn't move. Not yet. Moving now would trigger the instinct that makes fingers tighten on triggers. She'd trained too long, survived too much, to die because a boot didn't recognize a trident when he saw one. The sun beat down with the weight of judgment, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of rotors began to build. Helicopters incoming, probably medevac or quick reaction force spinning up from Sentinel. They'd seen the smoke. Everyone had seen the smoke. "Her ID," one of the other Marines said, a corporal with a Louisiana accent thick as molasses. "Just check her damn ID, Garrison, before someone we can't take back gets done." But Garrison's hand stayed steady now, fear crystallizing into something harder. Kiera understood it. She'd seen it before. The fear that comes from being wrong, from making a mistake that ends up in an after-action report and a career that stalls before it starts. In the distance, the helicopter sounds grew louder. A 60 Black Hawks, she thought, from the pitch of the rotors. 2 of them, maybe 3. Coming fast. The smoke from her aircraft was a beacon visible for miles, and in this part of the world, beacons attracted attention from all sides. Friendly, hostile, and the vast gray area in between where most wars are actually fought. She needed to move this situation forward before it metastasized into something nobody could walk back from. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Kiera Voss," she said, each word precisely calibrated. "Service number 771-83-4927. I'm assigned to VAQ-209, flying electronic warfare operations out of Naval Air Station Whidbey Island. That wreckage behind me is an EA-18G Growler, tail number 168846. I was conducting signals intelligence gathering when I took a hit from what I believe was a 9K-333 Verba MAN-PADS fired from approximately 2 clicks southwest of this position. My backseater ejected safely. His name is Lieutenant Marcus Hayes. Before you decide whether to pull that trigger, Marine, I suggest you get on your radio and confirm who the hell you're pointing your weapon at. The words hung in the superheated air between them. Garrison's jaw worked, grinding teeth, making a decision that would define the next 60 seconds and possibly the rest of his life. The corporal was already reaching for his radio, and Kiera could see the calculation happening behind Garrison's eyes. The math of doubt versus certainty, of following orders versus making the call yourself when everything's unclear. And the manual doesn't cover women with tridents climbing out of burning wreckage in places that aren't supposed to have burning wreckage. The Black Hawks were close enough now that she could feel the bass thump of the rotors through the ground, through her boots, through the exhaustion that was starting to creep in around the edges. Adrenaline could only hold gravity at bay for so long. She'd been running on fumes since the missile-locked tone started screaming in her headset, since she'd made the decision to push deeper into hostile airspace because the signal's intelligence they were collecting was worth the risk. At the center of everything, surrounded by armed confusion and smoke and the blank canvas of desert that cared nothing for human drama, Lieutenant Commander Kiera Voss stood perfectly still. The gun against her head, the sun overhead, the approaching helicopters, and in her mind the memory of other moments like this, other times when being underestimated had been an advantage and other times when it had nearly been fatal. Her call sign wasn't random. Widow. They'd given it to her after Kandahar, after the operation that wasn't supposed to happen and officially never did. After she'd brought her aircraft home on one engine and fumes and pure stubborn refusal to let physics have the final say. After they'd counted the holes in her airframe and stopped counting at 47. After her backseater that day had looked at her during the debrief and said, "You killed that mission dead," and walked away. Black Widow. The name stuck. The radio crackled again. Reaper 2-1, Phoenix Actual. We have visual on your position and the crash site. Be advised, we're tracking multiple vehicles approaching from the south. You need to secure that pilot and get to the extraction point. Over. Garrison heard it. They all heard it. The equation changed. The gun stayed pressed against Kiera's temple, but something in Garrison's posture shifted. The corporal with the radio was speaking rapidly into his handset now, and Kiera caught fragments. Female pilot, Trident insignia, claims VAQ-209. The response was immediate and sharp enough that even without hearing the actual words, she could read the tone. The corporal's eyes went wide. He looked at Garrison. "Sir, you need to lower your weapon right now." "Why?" Garrison's voice was tight, stretched thin. "Because Phoenix Actual just confirmed her identity, and apparently half of JSOC has been looking for her for the last 30 minutes. The corporal swallowed hard. "Sir, she's not just a pilot, she's—" He stopped, glanced at Kiera, then back to Garrison. "Command says we're to provide immediate security and get her to the extraction point. They're spinning up every asset in theater." The pressure against Kiera's temple eased, then disappeared. Garrison stepped back, lowering the Beretta, his face cycling through emotions too fast to catalog. Relief, confusion, embarrassment, and underneath it all, the dawning realization that he'd just held a gun to the head of someone whose personnel file probably had more redactions than readable text. The Black Hawks were overhead now, the downwash whipping sand into miniature storms. One peeled off to circle the crash site, while the other began its descent toward a clear patch of ground 50 meters away. Kiera finally allowed herself to move, rolling her shoulders, feeling the various aches and pains from the ejection announce themselves now that immediate crisis had downshifted into mere danger. She looked at Garrison, really looked at him, and saw past the fear to the kid underneath, who'd just been trying to do his job in a situation nobody had prepared him for. "No harm, Marine," she said quietly and meant it. "You did what you were supposed to do, secure the area, identify unknowns, that's good infantry work." She paused, then added, "Next time maybe check the patches first." She tapped the trident above her heart. Garrison's eyes dropped to it, then widened as full comprehension hit. Navy SEAL trident on a pilot. The cognitive dissonance played across his face like a movie. "You're a—" "Was," Kiera corrected. Past tense. "Flew helicopters with the teams for 6 years before I transitioned to fixed wing. But some things you don't stop being just because you switch platforms." The lead Black Hawk touched down, and immediately a team of operators poured out. Not standard infantry, Kiera noted. These were Tier 1 assets, probably DEVGRU or Delta, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who existed in the spaces between official acknowledgement. The team leader approached, his face mostly hidden behind ballistic glasses and a beard that spoke of months in the field. "Commander Voss," he said, not a question. "Need you mobile. We've got 4 technicals inbound from the south and another 2 from the west. Whatever you were doing up there, somebody wants to make sure you don't do it again." Kiera nodded. "My backseater, already extracted. He landed 2 clicks north, locals found him, but we got there first. He's secure." Relief flooded through her, momentarily overwhelming the professional detachment she wore like armor. Hayes was safe. That mattered more than the aircraft, more than the mission, more than the classified intelligence she'd been gathering in the minutes before the world turned violent. The team leader gestured toward the helicopter. "We need to move. Now." Kiera turned back to Garrison and his team. "Thank you for the welcome wagon, Marines. Stay safe." Then she was moving toward the Black Hawk, falling into the rhythm of insertion and extraction that had been burned into her muscles through thousands of repetitions. The operators formed a loose perimeter, weapons out, scanning sectors with the casual intensity of professionals who knew that casual was how you stayed alive. She climbed aboard, and immediately someone was pressing a bottle of water into her hand, while another operator began checking her for injuries she might not have noticed yet. The aircraft lifted off before she'd even finished buckling in, rising fast and banking hard to the north, away from the crash site and the approaching vehicles and the young Marine who'd learn a story tonight that he'd probably never be able to tell anyone outside classified spaces. Through the open door, Kiera watched the desert scroll pass below, the same desert she'd been staring at when Garrison's gun had been against her head. Same landscape, different altitude, completely different context. Story of her life, really. She closed her eyes for just a moment, letting the adrenaline begin its slow ebb, feeling the cost of survival present its bill. There would be debriefs. So many debriefs. Questions about what she'd seen, what she'd gathered, why she'd pushed so deep into hostile territory, whether the intelligence was worth the risk. There would be evaluations and after-action reports, and the grinding machinery of military bureaucracy turning her last 30 minutes into paperwork that would live in secure servers until the sun burned out. But right now, in this moment, she was alive. Hayes was alive. And somewhere behind her, a young Marine named Garrison was learning a lesson about assumptions that no training manual could teach. The operator next to her leaned close, speaking over the rotor noise. "Heard you gave those Marines quite the introduction." She opened her eyes, caught his grin. "Wasn't intentional. They rolled up on me about 3 minutes after I hit the ground. Didn't exactly have time to coordinate." "Yeah, well, the story's already making the rounds. Lieutenant draws down on a SEAL and lives to tell about it. Kid's either the luckiest or unluckiest Marine in theater, depending on how his command sees it." Kiera shook her head. "He did his job, can't fault that." The operator's grin widened. "You're more forgiving than some of the guys I know. Half of them would have had that weapon stripped and field stripped before anyone knew what happened." "Different situations call for different responses," she said simply. "He wasn't the threat. The situation was the threat. He was just trying to navigate it." They flew north for another 20 minutes, the desert giving way to more desert, an endless iteration of the same fundamental emptiness. Then, finally, The sprawl of Forward Operating Base Sentinel appeared on the horizon, a collection of temporary structures and hardened positions that represented the temporary nature of permanent war. The Black Hawk descended toward the landing zone, and Kiera could see the welcoming committee already assembled. Officers, intelligence personnel, probably a flight surgeon or three, all waiting to pick apart what had happened and extract every useful piece of information before filing it away in the vast library of lessons learned and mistakes avoided. The skids touched down. The rotors began their wind-down sequence, and Lieutenant Commander Kiera Voss, call sign Widow, stepped back into the world of official recognition and classified operations, and the strange double life of being both visible and invisible, acknowledged and unacknowledged, depending on who was asking and what clearance they held. Colonel Marcus Ashford was waiting at the edge of the landing zone, his expression unreadable behind aviator sunglasses that reflected the afternoon sun. He was Air Wing Commander, the person ultimately responsible for every aircraft that flew out of Sentinel, and therefore the person who would bear the weight of losing a $200 million Growler in hostile territory. As Kiera approached, he pulled off the sunglasses and she saw something unexpected in his eyes. Not anger, not even frustration. Relief, maybe, mixed with something that looked almost like respect. "Commander Voss," he said formally, then quieter, "Glad you're alive, Widow." "Thank you, sir, glad to be alive. Your backseater's in medical, minor abrasions, possible concussion, but he'll be fine. We'll debrief you both once the doctors clear you." He paused, studying her face. "What you pulled up there today, the signals intelligence you gathered before you went down. The analysts are calling it a game changer. 3 months of work would have taken 3 years through conventional means." Kiera nodded slowly. "Is it worth a Growler?" Ashford's smile was thin. "That's above my pay grade, but between you and me, yeah, probably. The question is whether it's worth you." It wasn't a question, not really. It was an acknowledgement of the calculation that every combat aviator made every time they stepped to their aircraft. The math of risk versus reward, of mission versus mortality, of serving something larger than yourself even when that something didn't always serve you back. "I'm still here, sir. So I guess we don't have to answer that yet." "No," Ashford agreed. "I guess we don't." He gestured toward the medical tent. "Get checked out, then we'll talk about what happens next." What happened next, as it turned out, was 6 hours of debriefs interspersed with medical examinations that confirmed what Kiera already knew. She'd survived an ejection at the edge of the performance envelope with nothing more than bruises, a laceration that required 5 stitches, and the kind of full-body ache that came from being violently separated from an aircraft at 300 knots. Hayes was in the bed next to her in medical, his face a canvas of bruises from where his mask had slammed against his face during the ejection sequence. "You good?" she asked. He gave a thumbs up. "Living the dream, ma'am. Nothing says Wednesday like getting shot down and rescued in the span of an hour." "Thursday," she corrected. "It's Thursday," he blinked. "Seriously, lost a day somewhere. Lost track after the 3rd debrief." They shared a look, the kind of wordless communication that came from flying together in situations where words were insufficient. They'd survived. The mission had succeeded. Everything else was just details and paperwork. The intelligence officers came next, asking questions that danced around classified information while trying to extract everything she knew about the signals she'd intercepted, the electronic warfare environment, the missile that had brought them down. She answered as precisely as she could, walking the line between operational security and operational necessity. Then came the flight surgeon's final assessment, the official stamp that said she was cleared to return to duty, and finally, blessed sleep in a tent that was too hot and too bright and absolutely perfect, because it meant she was alive to complain about it. She dreamed of the sky. She always dreamed of the sky. Not the empty blue of peaceful flight, but the crowded sky of combat operations where every mile contained 1,000 potential threats and every decision rippled outward in consequences you couldn't predict. She dreamed of the missile launch, that bright streak against the darker Earth, the seconds of calculation as she tried to outmaneuver physics and failed. She dreamed of the ejection, the violent separation, the moment of weightlessness before the parachute deployed. And she dreamed of Garrison's gun pressed against her temple, the cold circle of metal that had represented a different kind of threat, one born of confusion rather than malice. When she woke, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like fire. Someone had left a tray of food beside her cot, gone cold but still edible. She ate mechanically, refueling, preparing for whatever came next. What came next was Colonel Ashford, appearing in the doorway of the medical tent with an expression that suggested news. Not bad news necessarily, but news that would change something. "You're being pulled back to Whidbey," he said without preamble. "Orders came down from NAVAIR an hour ago. They want you stateside for a comprehensive debrief on the signal's intelligence and the loss of the aircraft." Kiera processed this. Being pulled from theater meant her deployment was over, at least temporarily. It meant going home to the Pacific Northwest, to the rain and the green that was the opposite of this desert. It meant distance from Hayes and the squadron and the rhythm of operations that had defined the last 4 months. When transport leaves at 0600, you've got 12 hours to pack your life into a duffel and say your goodbyes. She nodded slowly. Hayes stays. He's still cleared for duty, and we need every qualified backseater we can get. It made sense operationally. She was the pilot, the aircraft commander, the one ultimately responsible. She was the one they needed to debrief exhaustively. Hayes had done his job perfectly, but he wasn't the one who'd made the decisions that led to the shoot-down. That was on her. "Understood, sir." Ashford lingered for a moment, and Kiera sensed there was something else, something he wanted to say but wasn't sure how to frame. Finally, he pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and handed it to her. "This is unofficial, won't show up in any records, but the Marines who pulled you out, they asked me to give you this." She opened the box. Inside was a challenge coin, the kind that units created to commemorate operations or build morale. This one showed a trident on one side and a pair of pilot wings on the other, with words engraved around the edge. "Widow, some threats you don't make twice." Despite everything, Kiera smiled. "Tell them thank you, and tell Garrison he's got nothing to be embarrassed about." Already did. Kid's going to dine out on that story for years once it's declassified. The time I held a gun on a Navy SEAL and lived. Ashford left, and Kiera sat on the edge of the cot, turning the challenge coin over in her hands. The metal caught the fading light, reflecting colors that shifted as she rotated it. This was how legend started, she thought. Small moments blown into larger stories, repeated and embellished until the truth became something bigger than the actual events. She'd seen it happen before, watched as operations transformed into myths and men became legends. She'd never expected to be on the receiving end of it. The 12 hours passed quickly, filled with the administrative work of departure and the quiet moments of saying goodbye to people she might never see again. Hayes was the hardest. They met in the mess tent over coffee that tasted like regret and promises. "You keep that seat warm," she told him. "When they send me back, I want my backseater ready to go." "Yes, ma'am. But maybe next time we pick a mission that doesn't involve getting shot down." "Where's the fun in that?" They gripped hands, and in that simple gesture passed all the things that didn't need to be said. Trust, respect, the bond of people who'd faced death together and come through the other side. Then she was walking across the tarmac in the pre-dawn darkness, her duffel slung over one shoulder, heading toward a C-130 that would carry her out of this desert and back to a world that would ask her to explain things that couldn't really be explained. The loadmaster helped her secure her gear, and she strapped into one of the canvas seats that lined the cargo bay. The engine spooled up, that familiar turboprop whine that meant movement and transition, and the end of one chapter before the next one began. As the C-130 lifted off, Kiera looked out through one of the small windows, watching forward operating base Sentinel shrink into the distance, watching the desert flatten into abstraction, watching the sun begin its climb above the horizon. Somewhere down there, Garrison was probably sleeping or standing watch or writing a letter home that carefully edited out the classified parts of his day. Somewhere down there, the wreckage of her growler was being secured and studied and eventually recovered. And somewhere in the vast machinery of military intelligence, analysts were poring over the data she'd gathered, the signals intelligence that had cost $200 million and almost cost her life. Was it worth it? That question followed her across the ocean, through the refueling stop in Germany, through the long transit back to the United States. It followed her through the gates of Naval Air Station Whidbey Island, through the formal debriefs and informal conversations, through the weeks that turned into months as her story circulated through the community of people who flew and fought in the spaces that official acknowledgement didn't reach. The story of Widow, the pilot who'd pushed too deep and paid the price, and somehow turned survival into legend. The story grew in the telling. Some versions had her disarming Garrison with her bare hands. Others had her walking away from the crash without a scratch. All of them missed the essential truth, which was simpler and more complex than any story could capture. She'd just been doing her job, flying and fighting and making the calculations that meant someone made it home. The Navy put her back in the cockpit 6 months later, cleared for duty after the exhaustive debriefs finally exhausted themselves. She flew training missions out of Whidbey, taking new pilots up and teaching them the things that couldn't be learned from manuals. How to read the sky, how to trust your instincts, how to make decisions in the seconds between threat and response. And at night, in the quiet of her small house overlooking Puget Sound, she thought about the desert and the gun against her temple and the young Marine who'd been just as scared as she'd been in that moment, though for different reasons. She thought about the sky and what it meant to fly through it, knowing that each flight could be the last, that the calculations never stopped and the risks never disappeared. They just changed shape depending on the mission. The call came on a Tuesday. Colonel Ashford, though he was a general now, moved up and moved on but still checking in with the people who'd flown under his command. "Thought you'd want to know," he said. "That signals intelligence you gathered. It's been credited with disrupting 3 separate operations and providing targeting data that took out a major coordination node, saved lives, changed outcomes." "Good," Kiera said simply, because what else was there to say? There's talk of a commendation. Might be classified, might be public. Politics are still working themselves out, but I wanted you to hear it from me first. She appreciated that. After they hung up, she walked out onto her deck and stared at the gray water of Puget Sound, so different from the desert but equally indifferent to human drama. The sky above was clouded, promising rain, and somewhere in that sky, other pilots were flying other missions, making other calculations, writing other stories that would or wouldn't become legends depending on who survived to tell them. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. "Ma'am, this is Corporal Garrison. Got your contact from Colonel Ashford. Hope that's okay. Just wanted to say thank you for not making me famous for the wrong reasons, and also to say I'm sorry for, the gun thing." Kiera smiled and typed back, "Nothing to apologize for, Marine. You did your job, that's all any of us can do." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. "Yes, ma'am, but still. If you're ever near Camp Lejeune, first beers on me." "Deal," she wrote back, "but I'm buying the second one." The conversation ended there, but the connection remained, another thread in the web of relationships that defined military service. People connected by shared experience, by moments of crisis that revealed character, by the simple fact of having been there when there mattered. Days became weeks, and weeks became months, and the deployment cycle began again. New missions, new threats, new pilots to train, and new backseaters to fly with while Hayes finished his rotation downrange. The rhythm of it was familiar, comforting even. Wake, fly, debrief, sleep, repeat. Each iteration slightly different, each one adding to the catalog of experience that would eventually define a career. One afternoon, she was called to the squadron commander's office. Captain Reed was a taciturn man who'd flown F-18s before transitioning to Growlers, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You're going back," he said, sliding a folder across his desk. "Sentinel, same AO, same mission profile. They want you specifically because of your knowledge of the electronic warfare environment." Kiera picked up the folder, flipped through it. Deployment orders, mission briefs, intelligence assessments. It was all there. the complete package that would take her back to the desert and the heat and the risk. When? 2 weeks. Enough time to get your affairs in order and complete refresher training. She nodded slowly, feeling something settle inside her. This was it, the return to the place where she'd almost died, the closing of a circle that had been left open. I'll be ready. I know you will, Reed said. Then more quietly, the story you made last time, Widow. It's still circulating. People know your call sign now. That changes the dynamic. You'll have a reputation to live up to. Or live down, she suggested. He smiled thinly. Either way, it's pressure. Just remember why you fly. Not for the legend, not for the story. For the mission and the people who depend on you to get it right. It was good advice, the kind that came from experience rather than theory. She took it with her when she left, carried it through the 2 weeks of preparation and planning, held it close during the flight back across the ocean and the desert, and into the familiar sprawl of Forward Operating Base Sentinel. The base had changed in the months she'd been gone. New construction, new faces, the inevitable churn of military rotation. But the sky was the same, that vast empty blue that promised nothing and delivered everything depending on how you approached it. Hayes met her at the flight line, grinning like she'd never left. Welcome back, ma'am. I kept your seat warm just like you asked. Appreciated. We ready to fly. Been ready, just waiting for you to show up. They flew the next morning. A routine patrol that was anything but routine in an area where routine could get you killed. The Growler handled exactly the same, responsive and powerful, a machine designed to dominate the electromagnetic spectrum and survive in contested airspace. Kiera settled into the familiar rhythm of pre-flight checks and radio calls, Hayes in the back working the electronic warfare systems with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent the intervening months doing exactly this. They launched at dawn, climbing into a sky that was already hot, already shimmering with the promise of a day that would burn. The mission profile was similar to the one that had ended with a missile and an ejection. Signals intelligence gathering, electronic warfare support, watching and listening for threats in the spaces between the visible and invisible. Hours passed in concentrated attention. Radio calls, system checks, course corrections as they tracked their patrol route. The electronic warfare environment was active today. Lots of chatter and emissions as different forces maneuvered below. Kiera processed it all, building a mental picture of the battlefield that existed mostly in the spectrum humans couldn't see without machines. Then the missile launch warning screamed in her headset. Not again, her mind said, even as her hands were already moving, initiating evasive maneuvers, deploying countermeasures, calling the threat on the radio. But this time was different. This time they'd been expecting it. This time, the entire operation had been designed to draw out the enemy air defense systems so they could be targeted and destroyed. Magnum, called another voice on the tactical frequency, the code word for an anti-radiation missile launch. Somewhere in the sky, an F-16 Wild Weasel had just fired on the radar system that was tracking her aircraft. The missile lock broke. The threat indicator went quiet, and Kiera leveled out, breathing hard, feeling the adrenaline spike that came from being targeted and surviving. Widow, Phoenix Actual, Splash 1 SA-11, target destroyed. Nice work drawing them out. She keyed her mic. Happy to be the bait, Phoenix. Widow's back in the hunt. And she was. Not just in the sky, but in the mission, in the story, in the role she'd carved for herself through skill and survival and the stubborn refusal to let fear make her decisions. Below, in the desert, Marines and soldiers looked up at the contrails and knew that somewhere up there, Widow was flying. The legend made real, the story given form. And in the cockpit of a Growler at 20,000 feet, Lieutenant Commander Kiera Voss did what she'd always done. She flew, she fought, she came home, and the next day she did it again. Because that's what you did when the sky was your office and the mission was your purpose, and the legend was just the exhaust trail of a life lived at the edge of what was possible. In the years that followed, the story of the soldier who pressed a gun to her head would be told in 1,000 ready rooms and 100 briefings. It would be embellished and edited, expanded and compressed, turned into the kind of legend that militaries create to teach lessons that can't be taught any other way. The lesson about not judging based on appearance. The lesson about checking your targets before you commit. The lesson about the quiet professionals who wore tridents and wings and carried within them capabilities that existed in the spaces between official acknowledgement and classified operations. But for Kiera, it was never about the legend. It was about the flying, the mission, the people who depended on her to get it right. It was about the sky and what you could accomplish there if you were skilled enough, brave enough, foolish enough to believe that the risks were worth the rewards. She would fly for another decade, accumulating hours and missions and stories that mostly stayed classified. She would train a generation of pilots who would carry forward the lessons she'd learned. And eventually, when age and regulations finally grounded her, she would transition to teaching, passing on the knowledge that couldn't be found in manuals or simulators or any classroom that wasn't built at altitude where mistakes had consequences measured in physics and mortality. But that was all future. That was the long view, the arc of a career seen from the end rather than the middle. In the immediate present, in the cockpit of a Growler patrolling skis that belonged to whoever had the best sensors and the fastest reflexes, Lieutenant Commander Kiera Voss was exactly where she needed to be. Flying, fighting, living the story that would outlast her, in a sky that went on forever, carrying within it all the possibility and peril that made the choice to fly worth making every single time. The radio crackled with traffic. Hayes called out a contact. Kiera adjusted course, rolled into the threat, and did what she'd trained her entire life to do. She pressed on, always forward, always upward, into the contested sky where legends were made and names like Widow became shorthand for competence and courage, and the kind of quiet professionalism that most people would never see but some people would never forget. And somewhere far below, in a place where Marines patrolled and soldiers stood watch, a young man named Garrison looked up at the contrails and smiled, knowing that the pilot who taught him to check the patches before making assumptions was up there, still flying, still fighting, still writing a story that began with a gun to her head and ended with respect earned one mission at a time in skis that asked everything and gave back only what you could take for yourself. That was the story. That was the truth. That was the legend of Widow.